Few images evoke a sense of ancient Egypt more than this, the face of Nefertiti. She was the wife of a pharaoh and the stepmother to another.
For over 100 years, the bust of Nefertiti has been called the most beautiful face in ancient history. Millions have stood in front of it. Nobody knew what was underneath. Then a CT scanner cut through the painted plaster, and something appeared inside the limestone that was never supposed to be seen. Something the sculptor hid on purpose. Something that
Every year, more than 500,000 visitors come to Berlin to admire the Egyptian queen.
What the scan revealed is not what Nefertiti looked like. It is what someone in power needed her to look like, and the difference is disturbing. The face never meant to be seen. Here is the deal. For more than 100 years, the bust of Nefertiti has worked like a kind of spell. A perfect oval, a long, elegant neck, one painted eye, eternally calm, eternally young. Tourists press against the glass at the Neues Museum in Berlin and walk away convinced they have looked an ancient queen in the face. They have not. In 1912, a German archaeological expedition working at Tel El Amarna, the buried ruins of the lost capital of Akhenaten, broke into the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmose. The team found the bust lying on its side in the rubble, undisturbed for over 3,000 years. No inscription, no royal cartouche, no name, only a face. This limestone bust of her was carved more than 3,000 years ago and lay hidden until its discovery by a German archaeological team in Amarna in 1912. It took decades of careful comparison with surviving temple reliefs before scholars settled on an identification that the woman depicted was almost certainly Nefertiti, the great royal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt around 1353 to 1336 before the Common Era. The bust was carried back to Berlin and placed under glass, where it became one of the most photographed objects on the planet. Decades later, the imaging team decided to look inside it. Now, picture this. The technology they used was computed tomography, the same kind of scan a hospital uses on a patient, only tuned for art. It fires X-rays through the object from hundreds of angles and reconstructs the interior in 3 dimensions, layer by layer, without ever touching the surface. When the scan completed, the team gathered around the screen, expecting to confirm what every art historian had assumed for decades: a solid limestone core, a simple plaster overlay, a standard royal portrait. Refined but faithful. Beneath the famous painted exterior sat a second, separate face. Carved into the limestone with painstaking precision and hidden under millimeters of plaster was a portrait of a woman who looked nothing like the one in the museum. The nose was sharper, longer, more pronounced, faint lines at the corners of the mouth, a gentle crease beneath the eyes. The cheekbones sat slightly differently. The 2 halves of the face were not perfectly symmetrical. This was not the goddess behind the glass. This was a real human being, and someone had buried her under plaster and built a different woman on top. A sculptor who lied in modern times. Nefertiti has become one of the most public images for Berlin's museums. Now, think about what that means. Thutmose was not some apprentice. He was a master sculptor working at the highest level of royal patronage. He carved a faithful, slightly aged, slightly imperfect likeness of the most powerful woman in the kingdom, and then deliberately covered her up. Why? To answer that, you have to understand the strangest decade in Egyptian history. Akhenaten, Nefertiti's husband, did something no pharaoh before him had ever attempted. He demolished the religious foundation of the entire civilization. He shut down the temples of the old gods. He stripped the priesthoods of their land and authority. He declared there was now only one god worthy of worship, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, and that he and his wife were the only 2 human beings on earth allowed to speak to it. He moved the capital out into the desert and built a new city from scratch. It was the most radical religious revolution in 3,000 years of Egyptian history. And here is the thing. In that revolution, Nefertiti was not just a queen. She was the public face of an ideology. Reliefs from the period show her, standing beside Akhenaten in sacred ceremonies. Other reliefs show her alone, raising a war club over kneeling enemies, a pose previously reserved for pharaohs themselves. No Egyptian queen had ever been depicted that way. She was a co-ruler in everything but title, and possibly in title as well. So the bust was never a private memento. It was a tool of state propaganda. The smooth, ageless, perfectly balanced face was exactly the image a fragile new regime needed to project to a population, just forced to abandon every god they had ever known. The bust did not depict Nefertiti as she was. It depicted Nefertiti as she needed to appear. And here is the detail that should make your skin crawl. Archaeologists found it in a sculptor's workshop. Not a temple, not a tomb, a workshop. Which means it was a master template. A reference model copyists across the empire were meant to reproduce again and again, until every Egyptian who looked at her saw the same controlled image. That is the face the world has been admiring for a century. It is not a portrait, it is a mask. If you want to keep peeling back the layers of what was buried with this woman, the erased name, the broken body, the daughters who vanished, the tomb that may still be hidden, take a second to subscribe. This story gets darker the deeper you go, because the mask is only the first layer. A name erased. Here is where it gets strange. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's 17-year reign, Nefertiti vanishes. There is no announcement, no funeral inscription, no identified tomb. The most depicted woman in late-period Egypt, a figure who appeared on temple wall after temple wall, on palace relief after palace relief, simply disappears from the official record. For most of modern history, scholars assumed she had died of plague or illness, and her records were lost to time. The archaeology disagreed. Across multiple temple sites from the final years of Akhenaten's reign, researchers identified a pattern that does not fit accidental decay. Nefertiti's name had been deliberately chiseled out of inscriptions and replaced with a different name, not in one location, systematically across multiple monuments by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. And at the same moment, a previously obscure name began surfacing. Nefertiti, a ruler who governed briefly between Akhenaten's death and the rise of Tutankhamun. And here is what changes everything. The grammatical markers attached to Nefertiti's royal titles are feminine. The pronouns are feminine. The verb endings are feminine. Whoever Nefertiti was, the inscriptions consistently identified the ruler as a woman. The Egyptologist James Allen has spent years staring at those inscriptions. Allen and a number of other scholars have built a careful, almost surgical case that Nefertiti and Nefertiti were the same person, that after her husband's death, Nefertiti took the throne herself under a new name and ruled Egypt in her own right. Allen has pointed out detail after detail, the doubling of cartouches, the choice of epithets, the feminine grammatical endings on royal titles. And the picture is hard to argue with. There is precedent. Hatshepsut, the famous female pharaoh, also reinvented her royal identity to hold power. But what happens next is darker than reinvention. Inside the tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy king discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, researchers identified item after item bearing the marks of hurried, violent modification on golden jewelry, on coffins, on funerary objects. Original inscriptions had been physically scraped off and replaced, feminine pronouns overwritten with masculine ones, names gouged out and re-engraved. These were not the marks of decay. These were tools used in haste by people who needed something done before someone else found out. The conclusion is hard to escape. Many of the most famous treasures inside Tutankhamun's tomb were not made for him. They were made for a woman who came before him, most likely Nefertiti, ruling as Nefertiti, and were rapidly repurposed for the boy king after a sudden dynastic transition. Her memory was not just erased, it was stolen, reassigned, worn by someone else. And that face in Berlin, behind the glass, with no inscription on it. Now ask yourself why a queen who appeared on every temple wall in Egypt was depicted on the most beautiful sculpture of the age, without a single letter to identify her. Now, ask yourself who needed her, nameless. A body with broken bones. If names can be erased and treasures can be reassigned, the question that follows is unavoidable. What happened to her body? In 1817, explorers in the Valley of the Kings stumbled into a small, unfinished tomb, eventually catalogued as KV-21. Inside lay two female mummies. No names, no royal funerary equipment, no burial texts. One of the women, designated KV21B, lay with her left arm bent across her chest in the classic royal pose, her hand clenched as if it had once held a scepter. She had been a woman of high status, but her identity was a complete mystery. The remains were too damaged for the genetic techniques of the 20th century, and so, for nearly 200 years, she remained anonymous. In 2022, an international research team applied next-generation sequencing, a method capable of reconstructing genetic profiles from samples too small and too degraded for older approaches. They successfully recovered a complete mitochondrial DNA profile from KV21B. Mitochondrial DNA passes only through the maternal line, undiluted generation after generation. It is one of the most reliable tools for establishing maternal kinship. The result was an electric shock. KV21B shared a maternal lineage with Tutankhamun. She was not just royal, she was directly related on her mother's side to the most famous boy king in history. She could have been his mother, his aunt, or his older sister. When that finding is overlaid on the existing archaeology of the period, one identification rises far above the others. The most plausible candidate is Nefertiti. But the identification was not the part that disturbed the forensic team. The disturbing part was the body itself. When Dr. Sahar Salim of Cairo University, one of the world's leading forensic Egyptologists, conducted detailed CT scans of KV21B, she leaned in toward the screen and started cataloging what she was seeing. And what she was seeing was not natural decay. Both arms had been broken and twisted backward at unnatural angles. The rib cage had been crushed. The skull bore fractures along one side, and the edges were sharp, the kind that come from a direct, forceful blow, not from millennia of slow pressure under collapsing tomb debris. Salim's conclusion was that the injuries occurred at or very close to the time of death. And here is what makes it worse. A rib cage crushed by collapsing stone tends to fracture in predictable rounded patterns, following the lines of pressure. The breaks on KV21B did not. The arms, twisted and snapped behind the back, are consistent with restraint. A body forcibly held in a position the living woman would never have voluntarily assumed. The skull fractures, with their sharp inward edges, suggest a heavy weapon swung with intent. None of this is the language of accident. A high-status royal woman of the late 18th dynasty, genetically tied to the line of Tutankhamun, buried without a name in a tomb that did not match her station, her body bearing the marks of severe, deliberate violence. The bust in Berlin shows a perfect woman who never existed. The body in KV21 shows what may have actually happened to the woman the bust was pretending to be, and that is not even the worst part. A secret door inside a famous tomb. There is a competing theory about her resting place, and it is somehow even stranger than a violent death in an unmarked tomb. In 2015, the British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves walked out of a long stretch of work, hunched over a screen, and made an announcement that put the entire field on edge. He believed Nefertiti's tomb might be hidden behind a wall inside the most famous burial chamber in human history, the tomb of Tutankhamun, KV62. Reeves had not arrived at this through guesswork. He had spent months poring over ultra-high-resolution scans of the burial chamber walls, produced in 2014 by the Madrid-based scanning firm Factum Arte. He sat with those images night after night, zooming in past the painted surface, looking for what the human eye could not see standing in the chamber. Eventually, on the northern and western walls, he found them, faint linear patterns, subtle outlines, geometry that did not match the natural grain of the limestone. They looked to him like sealed doorways that had been plastered over and then painted to disappear. Now, here is where it gets uncomfortable. Tutankhamun's tomb is unusually small for a pharaoh. Its layout breaks the standard, royal design conventions. There are clear signs the burial was rushed. Reeves's theory is that the tomb was originally cut for someone else, most likely Nefertiti, and that when Tutankhamun died unexpectedly at around 18 or 19, the workers walled off the original occupants' chambers and squeezed the boy king into what was essentially the antechamber. In 2016, A Japanese research team using ground-penetrating radar reported anomalies behind the northern wall consistent with a hidden void. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities cautiously allowed for the possibility. The headlines exploded around the world. In 2018, an Italian team brought in newer radar equipment, ran a more thorough scan, and concluded the earlier signals were natural variations within the limestone, not chambers. The two findings have never been reconciled. Some researchers point out that radar and dense rock has significant margins of error, and that scan angles and interpretation methods can produce dramatically different conclusions. Reeves has not retreated from his position, not once. Egyptian authorities have to this day refused to authorize physical investigation of the wall. The only way to settle the question would be to drill through it. And drilling through one of the most precious archaeological surfaces on the planet is not something anyone is in a hurry to do. So, the possibility hangs there. She may be lying in silence on the other side of a thin painted wall, in a chamber millions of tourists walk past every year without knowing. Now, picture the bust again, behind its glass in Berlin. A face with no name. And maybe, far away in the desert, a body with no marker. Two halves of the same erasure separated by 3,000 years and one stretch of ocean. The daughters who vanished. Erasing a queen takes more than removing her name from temples. It takes erasing the people who carry her bloodline. And what happened to the 6 daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti suggests someone understood this very well. Picture them on the early temple walls of Amarna. 6 little girls, Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenpaten, Neferuaten, Tasherit, Neferura, Setapenre. They are everywhere in the early reliefs. Family scenes, religious processions, ceremonies of the Aten. Then, after year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, they begin to disappear one by one. Start with Meketaten, the second daughter. Around year 14 of the reign, she dies. There is a wall scene preserved in the royal tomb at Amarna that shows her parents grieving over her body. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are bent toward her, openly mourning, one of the only intimate emotional images from the entire ancient world. But here is the detail nobody can explain. Standing right next to the grieving parents in the same scene is a nurse, and the nurse is holding a newborn child. There is no inscription explaining who that baby is. There is no record of the child anywhere else. Some scholars have proposed something quietly horrifying, that Meketaten died in childbirth, possibly involving a close relative pairing within the royal family. A practice the Egyptian dynasties were known to use to keep the bloodline pure. The image freezes that moment forever. A dead daughter, a nameless infant, 2 parents who do not yet know the dynasty is collapsing under them. Now, Ankhesenpaten, the 3rd daughter. Hers is the most documented fate, and it is the one that breaks your heart. After the Amarna regime collapsed, she resurfaced under a new name, Ankhesenamun, and was married to her half-brother, Tutankhamun, in a political union designed to legitimize his claim to the throne. They were children. He died young and childless. Then she did something unprecedented. She picked up a stylus and wrote a letter to the king of the Hittites, the rival empire to the north, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her, because, as she put it, she would not lower herself to marry a servant. The Hittite prince was dispatched. He was murdered en route to Egypt. Then, Ankhesenamun disappears from the record entirely. No tomb, no mummy, no identification. The last royal daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, vanishing mid-sentence. The remaining 4 daughters leave almost no trace, no confirmed records of their deaths, no mummies definitively assigned to them. Of 6 daughters of one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history, the record preserves only fragments, and the gaps are far too clean, far too uniform to be random decay across the centuries. This was not bad luck. When the general Horemheb came to power after the brief reign of Tutankhamun's successor, he launched a deliberate campaign to wipe the Amarna period from Egyptian memory. He did not stop at chiseling names off temple walls. He removed the people who could carry that legacy forward, without identified tombs, without funerary cults, without political continuity, without recognized descendants. The Amarna line ceased to exist in the legal and religious framework of the kingdom. A nameless bust in a Berlin museum, a possible body with shattered bones in an unmarked tomb. 6 daughters dissolved into silence. This was not the work of time. This was a campaign. And it almost worked. The cost of a divine bloodline. There is one final layer, and it is the only one not authored by human hands. It was written into the genetic material of the family itself, and it helps explain why the dynasty fell apart so quickly and so violently. In 2010, a major study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association analyzed the DNA of several mummies linked to Tutankhamun. The aim was simple: confirm relationships. The findings went far beyond that. The data showed clear, repeated evidence of close kin marriages across multiple generations of the 18th dynasty. This was deliberate. Egyptian royals married within their immediate family because they believed they were preserving a divine bloodline traced directly back to the gods. The biological consequences were brutal. Generation after generation of close kin marriage causes harmful recessive genes to accumulate and surface. Tutankhamun is the textbook case. CT scans of his body revealed a club foot, a partially collapsed arch in the other foot, evidence of repeated bone disease, and a fragile skeletal frame. The walking sticks found in his tomb were not ceremonial. He needed them. He died at around 18 or 19, almost certainly from a cascade of medical complications his body could no longer fight off. In 2022, when the genetic profile of KVI21B was added to the analysis, a specific mutation drew the researchers' attention. It is associated with connective tissue disorders, conditions affecting the tissue-holding bones, organs, and blood vessels together. People with such disorders bruise more easily. Their bones break more easily. They bleed internally from injuries other people would survive. Now, place that finding next to the forensic evidence of violent trauma on KV21B's body. A darker possibility surfaces. Whoever attacked her may have known how fragile she was. They may have known that what would merely injure another person could kill her. There is one more biological layer. Tissue analyses of mummies from the Amarna period have shown unusually elevated levels of mercury, arsenic, and lead. These metals were components of the mineral pigments used extensively in the painted temples and palaces of the Aten cult. Long-term exposure damages the nervous system, weakens the immune response, and degrades bone density. The very environment Akhenaten and Nefertiti built around themselves, the dazzling sun-drenched temple complex glowing with painted color, may have been slowly poisoning the people who lived in it. It was not a conspiracy, but the result was a ruling family with weakened immunity, fragile bones, and shorter lifespans. Presiding over a religious revolution the rest of Egypt was waiting to undo. The dynasty did not just fail politically, it failed biologically. And Nefertiti, however powerful, was not exempt from any of it. What the face really is, now knowing all of it, walk back to the bust in the Neues Museum in Berlin. Stand in front of the glass. Look at the face the world thinks it knows. That sculpture is not a tribute to a great queen. It is not a celebration of timeless beauty. It is a constructed object made during an unstable period of history for a specific propaganda purpose. Preserved into the present mostly by accident because someone left it behind in a sculptor's workshop when the city of Amarna was abandoned and the desert swallowed everything else. The outer face is the official version, the version approved by power. The inner face the CT scan revealed is closer to the real woman, but even that is only stone, shaped by a sculptor's hands. The real woman, increasingly, appears to have been the body in KV21. Anonymous, broken, buried in conditions unworthy of the lowest, ranking royal, let alone the most powerful queen of her age. There is one paradox in this story, almost impossible to look away from. The people who erased her name from the temple walls, repurposed her treasures for a teenage successor, possibly walled up her tomb behind another, and eliminated her daughters from the historical record. They succeeded at almost everything they set out to do. Her name nearly vanished from Egyptian history for 3,000 years. Her tomb has never been positively identified. Her daughters left almost nothing behind. But there was one thing they failed to erase, and the reason is almost mythological in its irony. The bust survived precisely because it was anonymous. It had no inscription. It had no name. It was sitting in a sculptor's workshop, abandoned in the rubble of a city the next dynasty wanted forgotten. It was beneath the notice of the people running the campaign of erasure, so they left it. The sand covered it. And 3,000 years later, a German archaeologist brushed it off and pulled it out of the ground. The very anonymity forced on Nefertiti in death is the only reason her image survived at all. But the bust is not Nefertiti. The real woman, as modern science slowly peels back layer after layer, may have died in violence, been buried in shame, and been wiped from collective memory by the people who took power after her. DNA confirms her bloodline. CT scans reveal her trauma. Chemical analysis finds the slow poisons in her people's tissue. Radar searches for the chambers where she might still be lying. Every new tool removes another layer of the official story. The face emerging underneath, like the limestone face hidden beneath the plaster, is not perfect. It is not serene. It is not eternal. It is the face of a real woman in a real story surrounded by real enemies, whose ending history did its best to bury. The most beautiful sculpture in the world is not a portrait of a queen. It is evidence in a crime whose victim has never been named. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see that face behind the glass, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me what you think happened to her. Was she murdered by political enemies? Was she sealed alive behind that wall in Tutankhamun's tomb? Or is she still out there in a chamber no one has yet had the courage to open?